I'm Iris. I'm 38. And 6 months ago, I sat in my mother's therapy group circle and watched her face collapse as 6 versions of her own bone structure stared back at her. Each one sold, each one declared dead, each one a chapter in the empire she built on the fiction that I was the only twin who survived. But that's the end. Or the closest thing to an end I've found in the labyrinth of mirrors my mother constructed and called a career. To understand why I became a therapist who specialized in a trauma she invented, why I spent 37 years feeling incomplete without knowing what was missing, why I stood in my mother's group therapy room and introduced her to the woman who had been living my alternate life, you have to understand the economy of twins in the psychology industry. How 1 living child can be worth a book deal, but 2 can be worth a dynasty, and 3 can be worth a career that outlives the children themselves. I was born in the spring of 1987, or so I believed for 37 years. The story my mother, Dr. Vivienne Templeton, told me was precise, clinical, and devastating in its simplicity. I was a twin. My sister, whom she had named Iris also, Iris B, she called her, as if we were software versions, had died during delivery. Cardiac insufficiency, something about shared placentas, and compromised blood flow, medical terminology that my mother delivered with the practiced gravity of someone who had rehearsed it for audiences. You were the strong one, she would tell me, her hand on my forehead while I tried to sleep, her fingers tracing the scar above my eyebrow that she said came from a fall from my crib at 8 months. You lived for both of you. That's why you're special. That's why we have to understand you, document you, help others through you. She was already writing the book, I know that now. She had been writing it since before we were born, since the ultrasound that showed 2 heartbeats, since the moment she understood that twins were not just a pregnancy but a product. The Empty Crib, Healing When One Twin Survives. It was published when I was 3, with a photograph of me on the cover. Blonde, serious, too young to understand that my face was being used to sell grief to mothers I had never met. It became a classic in perinatal psychology. It was translated into 14 languages. It was taught in medical schools. And I was its living case study, its walking advertisement, its perpetual patient. I grew up in the architecture of my sister's absence. Our nursery had been prepared for 2, and my mother never removed the second crib. It stood in the corner of my room like a shrine, draped with white lace that yellowed over the years, filled with stuffed animals that were meant for a baby who never came home. I was not allowed to play in it. I was not allowed to touch it. I was allowed, however, to sit beside it during therapy sessions that my mother conducted in our home, sessions where other grieving mothers would hold me and weep into my hair while my mother took notes on their transference reactions and grief processing. I learned to be still. I learned to be comforting. I learned that my function was to be the living proof that survival was possible, that the empty crib could be filled with meaning even if it could never be filled with a child. My mother was not cruel in the obvious ways. She did not hit me. She did not scream. She simply observed me with the clinical detachment of someone who had already written my ending and was waiting for me to perform it correctly. Every milestone was documented. Every nightmare was recorded. Every friendship was analyzed for its survivor guilt manifestations. When I was 6, I told her I had dreamed about a girl who looked exactly like me, who held my hand in a room filled with water. She added 3 chapters to the revised edition of her book. When I was 12, I developed an aversion to mirrors that she diagnosed as identity diffusion related to unresolved twin loss. She prescribed medication and wrote a paper about it for the Journal of Perinatal Psychology. When I was 16, I tried to cut my face with a razor blade, not because I wanted to die, but because I wanted to see if there was someone else underneath my skin. She hospitalized me, filmed my recovery process for a documentary, and used the footage in her keynote address at the American Psychological Association's annual conference. I became a therapist because it was the only way to understand the language she had used to construct me. I specialized in twin loss because it was the only specialty I knew. I spent 15 years treating survivors, helping them process guilt that I suspected was not always theirs to carry, guiding them through grief that my mother had taught me was the only appropriate response to being alive. I was good at it. I was patient and empathetic, and I never told my patients that I understood their pain exactly, because I was beginning to suspect that I didn't. That my pain was not the pain of loss but the pain of something else, something I couldn't name, something that felt like living in a house where all the doors were painted on the walls. Then Marion came to my office. She was 43, a lawyer, sharp-eyed and brittle in the way of people who have built their entire personalities around not falling apart. Her twin sister had died of ovarian cancer 6 months earlier, and she was struggling with what she called the imposter syndrome of survival. I had heard this language before. I had used it myself. But there was something about Marion that unsettled me, something in the way she held her shoulders, the way she laughed with her mouth closed, the way she touched her left eyebrow when she was anxious. I touched my left eyebrow when I was anxious. I had the same scar. She brought a photograph to our third session. Her sister, dead now, smiling at a birthday party in 1989. I looked at the photograph and I felt the room tilt, the way rooms tilt when the floor you've stood on for decades reveals itself to be a lid. The woman in the photograph was not similar to me. She was identical. Same scar above the left eyebrow. Same cowlick in the hairline. Same gap between the front teeth that my mother had told me was a marker of your unique survival, a slight deformation from the shared blood flow that your sister couldn't endure. I made excuses. I ended the session early. I went home and I stood in front of the mirror I usually avoided, and I touched my face, and I tried to understand what I was seeing. Marion's sister had been born in a different city, to different parents in a different year according to the records. But she looked exactly like me. And she had died of ovarian cancer at 42, which was young, which was statistically unlikely, which was, I stopped. I didn't let myself complete the thought. I was a therapist. I knew about transference. I knew about projection. I knew about the human mind's capacity to find patterns where none existed, to manufacture connections out of desperation for meaning. I told myself that Marion's sister was a coincidence, a statistical anomaly, a trick of lighting and memory, and my own unresolved need for the sister my mother had constructed and destroyed. But I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the photograph. I kept touching my scar. And I kept remembering something my mother had said when I was 8, something I had filed away as one of her many clinical observations. You were born at St. Mary's, you know. That's where I did my residency. That's where I learned what grief looks like from the inside. That's where I learned to help people. I requested my birth records, not from my mother, from the hospital directly. It took 3 months, multiple forms, a lawyer's letter, and a fee I paid without understanding why I was paying it. The records arrived in a manila envelope that smelled of basement and forgetting. I opened it at my kitchen table at 3 in the morning, while my husband slept upstairs and my son's baby monitor breathed its mechanical lullaby. There were 2 death certificates. Not 1, 2. The first was dated March 15, 1987, the day of my birth. It certified the death of Iris Templeton, female, twin, born 7:43 a.m., deceased 8:15 a.m., cause of death, cardiac insufficiency, attending physician, Dr. Vivienne Templeton. This was the certificate I had known about. This was the sister my mother had mourned and written about and built her career upon. The second was dated March 18, 1987. 3 days later. It certified the death of Iris Templeton, female, twin, born 7:43 a.m., deceased 11:30 p.m., cause of death, cardiac insufficiency, attending physician, Dr. Vivienne Templeton. The same name. The same birth time. 2 different death certificates, 3 days apart. My hands were shaking so badly I had to put the papers down. I drank water. I stood up. I sat down. I told myself there was an explanation, a clerical error, a duplicate filing, something mundane and administrative that my mother's perfectionism would never have allowed, but that had happened anyway because hospitals were human institutions and humans made mistakes. But there was more. A transfer form. A body released to private funeral services. No destination listed. No funeral home named. Just my mother's signature, authorizing the transfer of deceased infant, Iris Templeton, for private family arrangements. And at the bottom of the envelope, a form I didn't understand at first. A tissue donation authorization for fetal research. Signed by my mother. Dated March 16, 1987, the day between the 2 death certificates. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at the kitchen table and I watched the sun rise and I tried to understand what my mother had done. Not what she had documented. What she had actually done. And I understood, with a clarity that felt like falling, that the death certificates were fiction, that there had been no body to transfer, that the tissue donation was cover, paperwork to explain the absence of remains, to create a trail that ended in research instead of truth. I hired a genetic investigator, a woman named Dr. Priya Nair, who specialized in finding people through databases, through samples, through the traces we leave in medical systems and ancestry websites, and the increasingly porous boundaries of genetic privacy. I gave her my DNA. I gave her the records. I gave her a photograph of Marian's dead sister, and I asked her to find matches. She found Serena Vance in 6 weeks. Serena lived in Portland, Oregon. She was 38 years old. She had 2 children. She was, according to Dr. Nair's analysis, genetically identical to me. Not a sister, not a twin in the way I had understood twins. The same person, split and duplicated, separated and grown in parallel without either of us knowing the other existed. I flew to Portland without telling anyone. I told my husband I was attending a conference. I told my mother nothing, which was the first secret I had kept from her since I was old enough to speak. I rented a car and I parked across from Serena's house, a craftsman bungalow with a porch swing and a garden that looked tended by someone who enjoyed tending it, and I watched her. She came out at 3 in the afternoon to collect her mail. She was wearing jeans and a sweater that had a hole in the elbow, and she moved with an ease I didn't recognize in myself, a looseness in the shoulders that suggested a life without constant observation. She had my face. My hair, though hers was shorter, my hands, though hers were rougher, stained with garden dirt. And she had my scar, the same scar above the left eyebrow. The same shape, the same discoloration, the same story I had been told about a fall from a crib that I now understood had never happened, or had happened to both of us, or had been manufactured by our mother to explain something else entirely. I didn't approach her, not then. I was not ready. I was still the therapist, still the case study, still the daughter of Dr. Vivienne Templeton who had built a career on my grief for a sister who might not be dead. I needed to understand more before I could risk understanding everything. I spent 6 months infiltrating her life, not as a stalker, as a therapist. I offered free counseling services through a Portland community center, specializing in maternal relationship issues, and I made sure my flyer appeared in the coffee shop Serena frequented. She called within a week. She was struggling with her mother, she said. An adoptive mother who had been kind but distant, who had never fully explained the adoption, who had died 5 years earlier, leaving only questions and a small inheritance. We met in my rented office, a space I had decorated to look professional and temporary, nothing that could be traced back to my real life. Serena sat across from me and she talked about her childhood, her marriage, her children, her sense of never quite belonging, of never quite understanding why she felt incomplete. I listened with the professional detachment I had cultivated for 15 years, and underneath it I felt something breaking, something that had been held in place by the architecture of my mother's narrative, something that was now crumbling under the weight of a face that matched mine, telling stories that mirrored mine. I used to dream about a girl who looked exactly like me, Serena said in our 4th session. She laughed, embarrassed. I know, it sounds crazy, like I wanted a twin or something, but it wasn't like that. It was like she was trying to tell me something, like she was trapped somewhere and I was supposed to find her. I kept my face still. I kept my voice even. I said, "What do you think she was trying to tell you?" Serena looked at me, and for a moment I saw something in her eyes that I recognized from my own mirror, the hunger for completion, the sense that half of yourself was missing and you didn't know where to look. I think, she said slowly, that she was trying to tell me I wasn't alone, that whatever I was feeling, someone else was feeling it too, even if I couldn't find her. I wanted to tell her then. I wanted to stand up and cross the room and take her hands and say, "I am here, I am real, I am the other half of your dream." But I didn't. Because I was still gathering evidence. Because I was still afraid. Because my mother had trained me to believe that my feelings were symptoms, and I needed to be sure that what I was feeling was not another of her constructions. I found David 3 months later. He was 41, living in Chicago, working as a structural engineer. He had been adopted at 3 years old by a couple who told him his birth mother had died in childbirth. He had a twin brother who had died at birth. The same story, the same structure, the same mother, though he didn't know it yet. I contacted him through a private investigator, through careful letters that explained who I was and what I suspected and what I needed from him. A DNA sample, a conversation, a witness. He was skeptical at first, then curious, then devastated. We met in a hotel room in Indianapolis, halfway between his city and mine, and I showed him the death certificates and the transfer forms and the tissue donation authorization, and he wept for an hour without making a sound. "There were more," he said finally, when he could speak. "I found them after you contacted me. I hired my own investigator. There are 3 others. A woman in Austin, a man in Seattle, another woman in Atlanta, all born in the same 5-year period, all with the same story, all with the same mother." Dr. Vivienne Templeton had not just sold one twin, she had manufactured twins. She had built a career on the tragedy of multiple births, on the survivor's burden, on the grief that she herself had orchestrated. She had kept some of us, sold others, declared dead those she couldn't use. She had written books about us. She had given keynote addresses about our pain. She had built an empire on empty cribs that had never needed to be empty. I spent another 3 months finding the others. The woman in Austin named Claire, who had been stillborn according to records but was alive and angry and running a bookstore. The man in Seattle, named Marcus, who had been transferred to research but was alive and confused and working as a musician. The woman in Atlanta, named Diana, who had been donated to science but was alive and broken and institutionalized for schizophrenia that I suspected was actually the result of early childhood trauma and separation. We formed a group. Not a support group in the therapeutic sense, though I used my skills to help us communicate. A conspiracy, a family of strangers who shared nothing but a face and a story and a mother who had treated us as inventory. We met in person once, in a cabin in the woods of upstate New York, and we sat in a circle and we looked at each other and we tried to understand what we were. Not twins. Not siblings. Variations on a theme, experiments in a laboratory, chapters in a book that had been written before we were born. I planned the confrontation for 6 months. Not a public exposure. Not a legal action. The crimes had prescribed, the records were fragmented. Our mother was too careful to leave evidence that would survive in court. A therapeutic intervention. A group session. The kind of session she had conducted thousands of times, but with patients she had never expected to meet. I told her I had developed a breakthrough technique for complex twin loss, and I wanted to demonstrate it with selected patients. I told her it would be the culmination of her work, the proof that her theories could heal even the most intractable cases. She was flattered. She was eager. She was, I think, beginning to feel the pressure of age and wanted one final triumph before retirement. The session was scheduled for a Thursday evening in her group therapy room, the same room where I had sat as a child, while grieving mothers wept into my hair. I arrived early and I arranged the chairs in a circle, 7 of them, and I placed a mirror behind her usual seat so that she would see our faces reflected behind her when she sat down. I dimmed the lights. I prepared the projection system with the documents I had collected, and I waited. She arrived at 6, wearing the charcoal suit she always wore for important sessions, carrying the leather portfolio that contained her notes and her pride. She looked at the circle of chairs and she smiled, the professional smile of a woman who has spent her life manufacturing intimacy. "Iris," she said, her voice warm with the particular warmth she used for audiences. "I'm so pleased you asked me to participate. Your work has always been the truest expression of my theories, the student surpassing the teacher." "I learned from the best, Mother," I said, and I meant it differently than she understood. The others arrived in sequence, spaced 5 minutes apart, each one entering quietly, each one taking a chair without speaking. Serena first, then David, then Claire, then Marcus, then Diana, then finally the last one, a woman named Ruth from Denver who I had found only 2 weeks before, who had been stillborn in 1989, but was alive and working as a hospice nurse, the irony so sharp I could barely look at it. My mother watched them enter with the polite attention of a hostess greeting guests. She did not recognize them. Why would she? She had never seen them grown. She had seen them as infants, as products, as inventory to be disposed of. She had never seen them as people. When Ruth sat down, I locked the door. My mother heard the click and turned, her expression shifting from professional warmth to professional concern. "Iris, is this part of the technique?" "Sit down, Mother," I said. "The session is about to begin." She sat in her usual chair. The mirror behind her caught her face and ours, 7 versions of her own architecture, 7 variations on the theme she had composed and abandoned. She looked at the mirror and I saw the moment she understood. The slight widening of the eyes, the tightening of the jaw, the professional mask cracking to reveal something underneath that I had never seen before. Not guilt, not shame. Calculation. the rapid assessment of a woman who has been caught and is already planning her next move. How extraordinary, she said, her voice steady, her composure rebuilding itself in real time. You've found them, the others. I wondered if you would someday. You're more resourceful than I gave you credit for, Iris. You don't seem surprised, I said. Why would I be surprised? I taught you everything you know about finding people, about understanding their pain, about using that understanding to help them. She smiled, the smile of a woman who has spent 40 years turning every accusation into a compliment. These are your siblings, Iris, your twins in a sense. I always hoped you would find them. I always planned for this moment when you would be ready to understand the complexity of your origins. You sold them, I said. You declared them dead. You built your career on their absence. I saved them, my mother corrected, her voice taking on the lecturing tone she used for keynote addresses. You were all born into a system that didn't value you, into families that couldn't care for you. I found alternatives. I found solutions. And yes, I used the narrative to help others, to fund research, to advance understanding. Is that so terrible? Is it terrible that some good came from difficult choices? You sold us, Serena said. Her voice was quiet but clear, the voice of a woman who had spent her life not knowing she had been commodified and was now learning to name it. You sold me for $25,000. I found the receipt in my adoptive mother's papers after she died. She never knew where the money went, but I know, it went to fund your first book tour. You were sick, my mother said, turning to face Serena directly, her clinical mask fully in place now. You had a cardiac condition. You required surgery that your adoptive parents couldn't afford. I found people who could. I found people who would love you. Is that a crime? Is it a crime to ensure that children are cared for? I wasn't sick, Serena said. I saw my medical records. The cardiac condition was minor, treatable. You exaggerated it to justify the sale, to make yourself the hero of the narrative. And what about me? David asked. His voice was rougher, angrier, the voice of a man who had spent his life believing his twin had died and was now learning that the death was a transaction. I was transferred to research. What research? What happened to my brother? My mother turned to him and I saw something flicker in her eyes. Not guilt. Impatience. The impatience of an artist whose work is being misunderstood by the audience. Your brother had severe developmental delays. He would have required institutionalization. I found a facility that could care for him, that could study his condition, that could help others with similar challenges. He lived longer than he would have with your birth parents. He contributed to science. Is that nothing? He was a baby, David said. Not a research subject, not a contribution, a baby. The others spoke. Claire, whose stillbirth had been documented with a death certificate signed by my mother's own hand. Marcus, whose transfer to research had no research facility attached to it, no records, no accountability. Diana, whose donation to science had resulted in 30 years of institutionalization for a schizophrenia that was actually complex PTSD from early separation trauma. Ruth, the hospice nurse, who had held the hands of dying strangers and never understood why she felt such a profound identification with their loneliness, until she learned that she had been born alone and declared dead in the same hour. My mother listened with the patience of a therapist, nodding at appropriate moments, making notes in her portfolio, treating our accusations as symptoms to be managed rather than truths to be acknowledged. I watched her and I felt something I had not expected. Not rage, not satisfaction, pity. The pity of a daughter who has finally understood that her mother is not a monster but a machine, not evil but empty, a person who has spent so long manufacturing emotions that she has forgotten what real ones feel like. I stood up. I walked to the projection system and I turned it on. The documents appeared on the screen behind her, the death certificates and transfer forms and tissue authorizations, the signatures in her handwriting, inconsistencies that no amount of clinical detachment could explain away. She didn't turn to look. She didn't need to. She had written these documents. She remembered them better than any projection could remind her. I am not going to sue you, I said. I'm not going to the police. I'm not going to write a book or make a documentary or do any of the things you've taught me to do with pain. I'm going to do something worse. I'm going to tell the truth. To your colleagues, your patients, to the institutions that have honored you. I'm going to tell them that Dr. Vivienne Templeton's career is built on children she sold, declared dead, and used as props in her own narrative of healing. And then I'm going to let them decide what to do with that information. My mother stood up. She smoothed her charcoal suit. She looked at each of us in turn, 7 versions of the face she had seen in mirrors and photographs and the covers of her books, and she smiled. The smile did not reach her eyes, it never had. "Do what you must," she said. "I've spent 40 years being misunderstood, 40 years being judged by people who couldn't comprehend the complexity of my choices. If you need to destroy me to feel whole, I won't stop you. I've never stopped you from anything, Iris. I've only ever wanted you to be the best version of yourself." She walked to the door. I didn't stop her. None of us did. We watched her leave. And then we sat in the circle of chairs, 7 strangers who shared a face and a story and a mother who had never been a mother, and we looked at each other in the mirror she had left behind. "What now?" Serena asked. "Now," I said, "we live, not as her patients, not as her case studies, not as her survivors or her victims or her legacy, as ourselves, as whatever we choose to become." I closed the practice 6 months later, not because of scandal. My mother's colleagues were too invested in her theories to abandon them quickly, and the legal system was too slow to provide the satisfaction of justice. I closed it because I was done being the therapist of a trauma I had never actually experienced. I was done treating survivors of loss when I was, it turned out, a survivor of theft. I opened a different kind of practice, a center for reunification, for people who had been separated by adoption or institutionalization or the casual cruelty of systems that treated children as inventory. Serena worked with me. David visited monthly. Claire sent books from her store for our library. Marcus played music at our openings. Diana, slowly, carefully, learned to live outside walls. Ruth became our director of hospice services, helping people die with dignity after a lifetime of helping them live with connection. We never found all of them. My mother had been prolific in her early career, and records were destroyed, and some of the children she had manufactured and sold were lost to time and distance and the anonymity of private transactions. But we found enough. Enough to know that we were not alone. Enough to know that our incompleteness was not a symptom but a wound, and that wounds could heal if you stopped picking at them. My mother died 2 years later, not from scandal, though the scandal eventually came. Not from legal consequences, though investigations were opened and closed with the efficiency that protects the powerful. She died alone, in the house where I had grown up, surrounded by empty cribs and yellowed lace, and the photographs of children she had used and discarded. I did not attend her funeral. I was in Portland, at Serena's daughter's birthday party, watching my genetic niece blow out candles on a cake that Serena had baked herself, in a house that smelled of flower and love, and the particular safety of a life that had never been observed for clinical purposes. Sometimes, late at night, I touched the scar above my eyebrow. I no longer believe the story about the crib. I believe that my mother marked us both, Serena and me, in the same way, with the same instrument, for the same reason, to make us identifiable, to make us hers, to inscribe her ownership on our bodies in a language that only she could read. The scar has faded over the years. I no longer see it in the mirror unless I look for it. And I am learning, slowly, to stop looking. That's my story. If someone ever told you that your pain was a product, that your grief was a career opportunity, that your existence was a case study in someone else's narrative, hear me. You are not a chapter. You are not a symptom. You are not the survivor of a tragedy that was manufactured for an audience. You are the author now, and the story is yours to write. I'm Claire. I'm 39. And for 4 months, I was a 15-year-old girl named Sarah, lonely and misunderstood and exactly what a predator wanted, because I needed to become the bait that caught the man who was hunting my daughter. This is not a story about heroism. It's a story about the version of yourself you become when the system can't help you, when the law sees nothing illegal, when the only way to protect your child is to enter the darkness yourself and hope you remember how to find the exit. Welcome to Little Bunny Stories, where we tell quiet stories about families, about the predators we don't see until they are inside our homes, and about the mothers who become something else to keep their children safe. If a story ever made you feel less alone, that's why we're here. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and let's walk through this one together. Here's my story. The first time I noticed something wrong with Emma, she was smiling at her phone at 2 a.m. I was coming home from a night shift at Seattle Children's, my scrub still smelling of antiseptic and the particular sadness of pediatric oncology. Emma was supposed to be asleep school night, strict rules, the boundaries I'd built like fortresses around her childhood. But her door was cracked, light spilling into the hallway, and I heard it, not the giggle of a teenager watching videos, but something softer, intimate, the sound of someone being seen. I pushed the door open. Emma, startled, shoved the phone under her pillow, the reflex too fast, too practiced. "Mom, you scared me. Who are you talking to?" "No one, just a friend, Sarah, from school." I'd never heard of Sarah. Emma had been at Franklin Middle for 2 years, and I knew every name she mentioned, the dramas, the crushes, the friendships that lasted weeks and dissolved over lunch tables. Sarah was new, and Emma's face when she said the name was not the face of a girl talking to a friend, it was the face of someone holding a secret that felt like power. "Since when do you have a friend named Sarah?" "Since, I don't know, a few weeks." Emma sat up, pulling the blanket to her chin, a barrier between us. "She's really nice, Mom. She gets me, like actually gets me." The phrase landed like a stone. Actually gets me. The words every parent dreads, the translation of which is, you don't. I didn't push. I'd learned not to push with Emma, who'd inherited my stubbornness and her father's talent for withdrawal. I kissed her forehead, told her to sleep, and went to my own room where I lay awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling, remembering every article I'd read about online predators, every warning I'd given Emma about strangers, every confidence I'd had that my vigilance was enough. It wasn't. I knew it the way nurses know infection, by the subtle signs, the slight fever, the wrong color in the wound. Emma changed over the next month. Not dramatically, not the sudden withdrawal that parenting books describe, not the obvious red flags that teachers are trained to notice. She changed in ways that almost looked like improvement. She was happier, more engaged with school. She started wearing makeup, not the heavy kind I'd fought against, but subtle, careful, the kind that suggested someone was helping her choose. She talked about English class with enthusiasm she'd never shown before. "Mr. Bennett is amazing, Mom. He makes us feel like our opinions matter." Mr. Bennett. I'd met him at parent-teacher conferences, 32, handsome in a tired way, the kind of teacher students loved and parents trusted. He'd shaken my hand, called Emma exceptionally perceptive, told me I should be proud. I'd been proud. Grateful that someone saw my daughter's potential, that she had a male role model who wasn't her absent father, who wasn't the rotating cast of men I'd carefully kept out of our lives. Now I watched Emma say his name, and I felt the first cold thread of something I couldn't name. She was on her phone more. Guarded about it in ways she hadn't been before, tilting the screen away when I walked past, taking it to the bathroom, sleeping with it under her pillow. When I asked about Sarah, she was vague. "She moved here from Portland. Her parents are divorced too, we just connect." I never met Sarah. Never saw her at school events, never heard her voice on a call, never found her in Emma's social media. There were photos Emma showed me once, quickly, a blurry image of a girl with brown hair and no distinct features, but never an invitation to meet, never a sleepover request, never the normal integration of a new friend into a teenager's life. I told myself I was paranoid, that this was what single mothers did, invented threats because the real ones were too large to manage. I told myself Emma was entitled to privacy, to secrets, to a life that didn't include my constant surveillance. Then I found the messages. It wasn't intentional. Not exactly. Emma fell asleep on the couch, phone in her hand, the screen still lit. I was going to move it, charge it, the maternal reflex of someone who'd spent 14 years managing the small logistics of another person's existence. But the screen caught my eye. A messaging app I didn't recognize, not the standard ones we used, something encrypted, something hidden. I shouldn't have looked. I knew I shouldn't have looked. But I was a mother, and my daughter was smiling at 2 a.m., and there was a name on that screen that wasn't Sarah. Mr. Bennett. I sat on the floor beside the couch, my scrub still damp from the rain outside, and I read. Not everything, there were months of messages, thousands of words, but enough. Enough to understand that Sarah was a fiction, a construct, a way for Emma to hide what she didn't fully understand herself. Enough to see the pattern that Mr. Bennett had built, brick by careful brick. The messages were not explicit, not illegal on the surface. He was careful, a professional who knew exactly where the lines were drawn and how to dance just behind them. He asked about her day, her feelings, her fears. He validated her in ways that made my parenting feel like failure. "Your mother loves you, but she doesn't see you, not the real you. You're special, Emma. I've known since the first essay you wrote. When you're older, when you're ready, there are people who will understand what we have. What we have." The phrase that turned my stomach, that made me run to the bathroom and vomit until my ribs ached, that made me sit on the cold tile and cry in silence so Emma wouldn't wake. There were no photos, no suggestions of meetings, no physical contact described. Just words, careful, intimate, increasingly possessive words that created a world where Emma was seen, understood, special in ways her mother couldn't comprehend. A world where a 32-year-old man and a 14-year-old girl had something unique that needed to be protected, hidden, preserved until she was old enough. I knew what this was. Every nurse knows grooming, has seen the patterns in patient histories, the slow escalation of boundary violations that start with attention and end with damage. I knew that Bennett was skilled, patient, playing a long game that would end when Emma was legal, or when he found a replacement, whichever came first. I also knew that the messages as they stood were not enough for police, not enough for school administration, not enough for anything except my own helpless rage, my own failure to see what had been happening under my roof, in my daughter's phone, in the life I'd thought I was protecting. I sat on that bathroom floor until dawn, and I made a decision. Not to confront Emma, that would close her off, make her defend him, drive her deeper into the secret world he'd created. Not to go to the school. Bennett had excellent relationships with administration, parents who adored him, a reputation that would shield him from accusation without proof. I would become Sarah, the friend who understood, the girl who was lonely, misunderstood, exactly what Bennett hunted for. I would enter his world and let him hunt me, document everything, and wait for him to cross the line he was carefully avoiding with Emma. I would become the bait, and I would hope I could find my way back to being Claire. Creating Sarah took 3 weeks. I researched everything the apps teenagers used, the language they spoke, the references they made. I created accounts, built a history, added friends who were actually other personas I controlled. I made Sarah 15, from a broken home, new to Seattle, struggling to fit in. The profile picture was a stock image, carefully chosen, generic enough to be anyone. Then I found Bennett's social media. Not his professional accounts, his private ones, the ones he thought were hidden, the ones where he followed teenage influencers, commented on their photos with emojis that were just ambiguous enough, just suggestive enough. I used these to understand his patterns, his interests, his vulnerabilities. He liked poetry, Rilke, Neruda, the romantic classics. He liked music, indie folk, the kind that made loneliness sound beautiful. He liked girls who were old souls, who didn't fit in, who needed someone to tell them they were special. I made Sarah an old soul. The first contact was indirect. A comment on a public post, something about a book he'd mentioned in class. "I read that because of you," I wrote. "No one else gets why it matters." He responded, carefully, professionally, but with a warmth that was just beyond appropriate. I'm glad it resonated, rare to find students who care about literature anymore. I let a week pass, then another comment, another response. Gradually I moved to direct messages. Sarah was hesitant, vulnerable, the kind of girl who'd been hurt before and was careful about trust. "I don't usually talk to teachers outside of school," I wrote. "But you seem different, like you actually see people." It took him 4 days to suggest we move to a more private app. The encrypted one, the one he'd used with Emma. I agreed, my heart pounding in my chest at 3 a.m. while Emma slept in the next room, while I typed words that felt like poison, that made me understand how predators worked because I was becoming one. Bennett was good. Patient. He didn't rush, didn't push, didn't do anything that could be clearly identified as wrong. He asked about my home life, my relationships, my dreams. He told me I was perceptive beyond my years, that I had a soul that needed nurturing. He sent me poems, Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet, the sections about solitude and patience and waiting for love to mature. I responded with the right mixture of gratitude and hesitation, of vulnerability and strength. I made Sarah someone he wanted to win, someone whose trust would feel like an achievement, and I documented everything. Screenshots, timestamps, context, the slow escalation that was invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it but unmistakable once you saw the pattern. He told me about Emma, not by name, a student who reminds me of you, he said. Special but not ready, not like you are. I wanted to scream, to reach through the screen and destroy him. Instead, I made Sarah jealous, possessive, eager to prove she was more special than this unnamed student. It worked. He began to focus on Sarah, to neglect whatever he'd been building with Emma. I watched my daughter's phone, still checking, still monitoring, the violation of privacy that felt like survival, and saw his messages to her decrease, become more distant, more professional. Emma was confused, hurt, but not devastated. She was 14, her attention shifting, her special connection fading as quickly as it had formed. She didn't know why, I did. I was sacrificing another child, my fake Sarah, to save my real one. And the morality of it kept me awake, made me question everything, made me understand that the line between protector and predator was thinner than I'd ever imagined. By month 3, Bennett was frustrated. Sarah, I was too careful, too hesitant, too slow to commit, to cross the boundaries he was pushing. He began to make mistakes, suggesting meetings in ways that were less careful, sending messages that were more explicitly romantic, confessing things that approached illegality. I've had connections before, he wrote one night. Students who understood me in ways no adult could, but they weren't ready, they didn't have your maturity, your depth. I asked about them, pressed gently, the way Sarah would, curious, not accusatory, and he told me, not names but patterns. Girls he'd mentored, inspired, loved from a distance. Girls he'd watched graduate, move on, forget him. Girls who'd never told anyone because they knew it was special, even if it couldn't be acted upon. I found them. 3 of them from 5 years of teaching, scattered across social media, their teenage selves preserved in photos and posts. I contacted them, not as Sarah, as Claire, a mother concerned about her daughter. 2 didn't respond. One did, a young woman named Julia, now 22, living in Portland, working as a barista. She called me, voice shaking, and said, I thought I was the only one, I thought it was my fault. It wasn't her fault. It wasn't any of their faults. It was Bennett, patient, careful, untouchable, and the system that couldn't see him because he never crossed the lines that would make him visible. Julia gave me her messages. Old, preserved, a pattern identical to Emma's, to Sarah's. The same poetry, the same validation, the same slow building of a world where only he understood. She'd been 16, then 17, then 18, and he'd let her go, gently, carefully, leaving her confused about what had happened, whether it had been real, whether she was crazy for feeling loss. I added her evidence to mine. And I waited for Bennett to make the final mistake. It came in month 4. Frustrated by Sarah's continued hesitation, he suggested a meeting. Just coffee, he wrote. Public safe. I need to see if what we have is real or if I'm imagining something beautiful. I agreed, but I didn't go. I hired a private detective, a woman named Alina, recommended by a colleague who'd used her in a custody case. I paid her with savings I'd accumulated over years of night shifts, money meant for Emma's college, for our future. Alina was young enough to pass for 15, experienced enough to wear a wire, brave enough to sit across from a predator and let him talk. I watched from a car across the street, through binoculars, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Bennett arrived with flowers, not roses, lilies, purer, more innocent, he'd told Sarah. He ordered coffee, paid, sat too close. He talked about our connection, about waiting for the right time, how hard it is to find someone who truly sees you. Alina played Sarah perfectly, hesitant, flattered, young enough to be overwhelmed by attention from an adult. She let him touch her hand, her shoulder. She let him suggest they go to his apartment, just to talk somewhere private. She recorded everything. When he reached for her knee, she stood up. I need to go, she said, the signal we'd arranged. This is too much, too fast. He followed her to the door, tried to persuade her gently the way he'd persuaded so many others. Don't be scared, Sarah. What we have is rare, don't throw it away. She left. I watched her cross the street, get in her car, drive away. And I watched Bennett stand in the coffee shop doorway, flowers in hand, confusion on his face, the predator who'd just missed his prey. I had enough. The video, the messages, the pattern, the witnesses, but I still didn't go to the police. Not yet, because I knew that individual evidence might not be enough. He'd been careful for years, he had lawyers, he had a reputation. I needed more, I needed an army. I organized a meeting. Not at the school, they'd protect him, investigate me, find a way to make this disappear. I organized it at my hospital, in a conference room after hours, and I invited every parent of every girl Bennett had taught in 5 years. I used Julia's contacts, social media, old yearbooks. I found 23 mothers and fathers who'd wondered, worried, noticed changes they couldn't explain. I showed them everything, not as accusations, as patterns. The poetry, the attention, the slow building of intimacy that never quite crossed into illegality but left their daughters changed, confused, sometimes broken. I showed them Sarah's messages, Alina's video, the careful escalation that was invisible alone but unmistakable together. They saw it. Not all of them, some defended Bennett, called me paranoid, accused me of manufacturing a threat where none existed. But enough saw. Enough remembered their daughter's sudden changes, their secretiveness, their special relationships with a teacher who understood them. We went to the school together. 15 parents, documented evidence, a demand for investigation. The administration, faced with numbers, with patterns, with the threat of public scandal, suspended Bennett pending review. He was angry, defensive, threatened lawsuits. But he was also exposed, the careful facade cracking, the inspiring teacher becoming someone parents watched, whispered about, avoided. And then I sent Sarah one final message. I know who you are, I wrote. I know what you do. I have everything, the messages, the video, the witnesses. You can run, start over somewhere else, find new girls who don't know your pattern. Or you can stay and fight, and I'll make sure every parent in every city you work in knows exactly what you are. He ran. Resigned, moved, tried to start over in another state. But I sent his file, anonymous, complete, devastating, to every school district in his new area, to the licensing board, to the local police, not as accusation but as information, a pattern to watch for. He was arrested 6 months later, not for what he did to Emma, that was too hard to prove, too carefully constructed, but for what he confessed to Sarah, for the video from the coffee shop, for the pattern that 15 parents recognized and testified to. 10 years, sex offender registry, a career destroyed, a life contained. I told Emma the truth. Not everything, not Sarah, not the deception, not the months I spent becoming what I hunted. Just that I'd discovered Bennett's pattern, that he couldn't hurt her anymore, that she was safe. She was angry. Furious, actually, that I'd invaded her privacy, that I'd kept secrets, that I hadn't trusted her to handle it herself. I'm not a child, Mom, I would have told you eventually. Eventually might have been too late, I said. And I'm sorry. Sorry for not seeing sooner, sorry for spying, sorry for being the kind of mother who has to become someone else to protect you. But I'm not sorry for keeping you safe. I'll never be sorry for that. She didn't forgive me immediately. We went to therapy together, separately, the work of rebuilding trust that I'd broken even as I saved her from worse. She graduated high school, went to college, became someone who understood, finally, that her mother's paranoia was love distorted by fear, that the invasion of privacy was violation but also survival. I deleted Sarah's accounts, all of them, the history, the friends, the carefully constructed persona that had never existed but had felt in moments more real than Claire. I deleted her with a grief I didn't expect, a mourning for the girl I'd been, the vulnerability I'd performed, the darkness I'd entered and somehow found my way out of. But I didn't forget. I still wake at 3 a.m. sometimes, heart pounding, reaching for a phone that isn't there, typing messages to someone who doesn't exist. I still smell the antiseptic of the hospital and remember the bathroom floor where I vomited and decided to become a monster to catch a monster. I still wonder if I lost something in those months. If the part of me that was Sarah, patient, manipulative, willing to deceive, is still there, dormant, waiting for the next threat that requires her to wake. That's my story. If you're a parent who checks phones, who moves neighborhoods, who never sleeps fully because some part of you knows the world is hunting your child, hear me, your paranoia is not wrong, but your paranoia alone is not enough. Sometimes you have to become what you fear to understand it. And sometimes understanding is the only weapon that works. I'm Claire, I'm 40 now. I'm still a nurse, still working nights, still watching my daughter from a distance that feels safer than closeness. I still don't trust easily. I still check, still monitor, still wait for the threat I know is coming because it always comes. But I'm also still here. Still Claire, despite everything. Still a mother who would become anyone, anything to keep her child safe. And if that makes me a monster, then I am the monster that monsters fear. And I can live with that. See you in the next story.